Back room, low lamp. A quiet clock that sounds louder than it should. Somewhere in New York, a glass clinks once, too gentle to be an accident. A folded newspaper sits on the table like a prop or a warning. Lucky Luciano looks relaxed, almost bored. Bumpy Johnson looks still, not stiff, not scared. Still like a man who won't give the room anything to read. Luciano doesn't raise his voice. He doesn't need to. He names a number like it's already been agreed to. 5,000 a week? The words land heavy. Not because Harlem can't pay. Because Harlem can't breathe under that kind of leash. Nobody interrupts. Nobody coughs. Nobody moves. And that's the thing about real power. When it speaks softly, everyone else goes quiet. An envelope slides forward across the table. More symbols than payment. A weekly tribute turned into a habit. A receipt for obedience. Bumpy doesn't touch it. He doesn't even look down. He keeps his eyes where they belong, on Luciano. And when the number hits, Bumpy doesn't blink. Luciano repeats it again, slower this time. 5,000 a week? Like he's teaching a lesson. Like he's giving Harlem a choice that isn't really a choice. Then Luciano adds the real demand almost casually. Not cash. Control. Not pay me. Work under my command. And suddenly the room changes shape. Because money is math, but subordination is identity. Bumpy's face stays calm, but the air gets tighter. Like the walls leaned in. Like everybody understands what the envelope really is. Not a bill, a collar. And the next move, Bumpy's move, will decide whether Harlem stays Harlem or becomes somebody else's territory with a different name. Late 1934. Harlem is running on something stronger than jazz. Cash. Small bills folded into pockets, passed hand to hand, collected quietly in barbershops, beauty salons, candy stores, places that look ordinary until you realize they're part of a machine. The policy game, what most people just call the numbers, is simple on the surface. Pick 3 digits. Hope they match a daily number pulled from public sources. But what that simplicity creates is constant motion. Every day there's action. Every day there's a collection. Every day there's a payout. A steady river of money that doesn't wait for weekends or holidays. That's why the numbers racket becomes more than gambling. It becomes infrastructure. In a neighborhood where banks and institutions don't always open doors, the underground economy becomes the place people reach for hope, rent money, grocery money, the fantasy of a clean break. And at the top of that machine, you don't just have a gangster. You have an operator, a banker, somebody who keeps the wheel turning and keeps the neighborhood paid. Stephanie Street Claire was one of Harlem's most powerful numbers bankers in that era. Historical sources describe her operation minting serious money, with a whole labor force behind it. Bumpy's position is closer to the engine than the spotlight. He's the local man who makes sure the system runs. Collection, discipline, protection, order. And that's why Luciano's weekly demand matters. It's ownership. If you pay every week, you're reporting every week. And if you're reporting every week, then Harlem isn't yours. You're just running it for somebody else. Back in that back room, the number isn't just a number. It's a sentence. 5,000 a week. In some versions, Luciano says it like he's ordering coffee. Calm, flat, already decided. But Bumpy understands what a weekly demand really means. A weekly demand isn't income. It's ownership. If you pay every week, you're reporting every week. And if you're reporting every week, you're not a partner. You're a subordinate. That's why, in the same dramatized retellings, Luciano adds a second condition almost like an afterthought. Not just pay. Work under my command. Now, it's not about money at all. It's about control. Because Harlem's numbers game isn't a one-time score. It's constant cash flow, built on daily play, daily collection, daily power. Whoever controls that flow controls the neighborhood's oxygen. And Luciano's demand is a trap with 3 doors, all bad. Accept it and you put Harlem on a leash. Refuse it, and you invite consequences from men who don't like being told no. Try to negotiate, and you risk looking weak, like you're asking permission to keep what you already built. Meanwhile, the larger reality is tightening too. The numbers war era is full of pressure, violence, and outside forces reshuffling the board, especially as Dutch Schultz's fall approaches and power consolidates downtown. So Bumpy stares at the envelope and doesn't touch it, because he knows the truth. This wasn't a tax. It was a collar. Bumpy lets the demand hang in the air. He doesn't rush to answer it. He doesn't reach for the envelope. He doesn't give the room the satisfaction of a reaction. Just silence. The kind of silence that makes everybody else suddenly aware of their own breathing. A clock ticks. A glass sweats on the table. Somebody shifts in their chair and immediately regrets it. Because in Harlem business, real Harlem business, the first man to speak after a demand is usually the first man to lose. Luciano waits him out. Like patience is another kind of muscle. Like the number is already written in stone, 5,000 a week, and Bumpy just keeps looking at him. Not defiant, measured, as if he's weighing the demand the way a chess player weighs a sacrifice, what it costs now and what it costs later. Then Bumpy finally speaks. Not loud, not angry. One calm question, more blade than sentence. Is this business or tribute? The words don't challenge Luciano's power. They challenge the frame. Because tribute means you kneel. Tribute means you report. Tribute means Harlem stops being Harlem and starts being a department. And the room feels it. That subtle shift, not a threat. A line drawn with manners. A reminder that Bumpy isn't refusing because he can't pay. He's refusing because paying the wrong way means surrendering the whole board. He didn't raise his voice. He raised the stakes. Bumpy doesn't slam the table. He doesn't laugh. He doesn't act offended like the number is impossible. That's the first thing that throws everyone off. Because if you act broke, you look weak. And if you act angry, you look reckless. So Bumpy does something sharper. He makes the refusal clean, not emotional, structural, not like that, not weekly, not as tribute, because a weekly payment isn't just money, it's a schedule. A leash, a reminder that every 7 days Harlem has to check in like a child asking permission to keep breathing. And Bumpy doesn't say it like a speech. He says it like a correction. Like he's moving a piece back onto the right square. Then comes the second part, the part that makes the room colder. Because the number was heavy, but this is heavier. Not under you, not under your command. That's the real line. Because Bumpy isn't refusing cash. He's refusing subordination. He's refusing to turn Harlem into a department that reports downtown. He's refusing to let his name become somebody else's stamp. And for the first time, you can feel Luciano's patience shift. Not rage, not panic. Just that tiny pause a powerful man makes when the world doesn't move the way it's supposed to. Because refusal is common. But refusal with calm, refusal with math, that's rare. Bumpy finally reaches for his drink. Not to celebrate, to dominate the moment. A slow sip like the decision is already made. Like the room can either accept the terms or accept the consequences. And then he reframes it. If we do this, it's partnership terms, not tribute terms. A cut, not a collar. Bumpy makes it plain with phrases like, you can have a cut, you can't have my name. I'll share profit, I won't share my spine. That's the chess move. Because it's not a no that ends the conversation. It's a no that forces a better offer. And historically, the verifiable shape of what came next fits that logic. After Dutch Schultz was killed in 1935, accounts describe Bumpy reaching an arrangement that let Harlem's rackets run as a locally controlled operation, while Luciano's side still took a slice of the profits. So in this room, the stakes are the same. Bumpy is telling Luciano, you can be paid, but you can't own the board. And Luciano, for all his power, has to consider the truth that makes men like him practical. Harlem is expensive to fight. Harlem brings heat. Harlem doesn't stay quiet when it bleeds. And Bumpy Johnson, small, calm, unreadable, has just proven he's not begging. He's negotiating from the only position that matters. Autonomy. The envelope sits there, untouched, not rejected as money, rejected as meaning. And the room understands what just happened. He didn't refuse to pay. He refused to kneel. By the time the smoke clears, the story stops being a backroom legend and starts matching the paper trail. Fall of 1935. Harlem's numbers war has already burned hot. Too loud, too messy, too many bodies for a business that's supposed to run like a clock. Then Dutch Schultz gets taken off the board in Newark, and the whole underworld feels the shift in the air. Not a victory speech, not fireworks, just silence. Because when Schultz goes down, the question isn't who's tough enough to replace him. It's who's smart enough to keep the money moving without waking the whole city. And this is where the cleaner version of the Bumpy Luciano story starts to lock in. According to later biographies and historical summaries, once Schultz is out of the way, Bumpy Johnson and Lucky Luciano, men who'd been on opposite sides, move towards something colder than friendship and sharper than fear, an arrangement. Not a weekly tribute with a number you can repeat like a threat, but a cut, a percentage, a business slice that lets Harlem stay Harlem on the surface while the syndicate still eats in the back room. In other words, Bumpy keeps operating independently and Luciano's side gets paid without having to invade. Harlem doesn't surrender. Harlem gets managed on Harlem's terms with a tax no one talks about out loud. So when the dramatic retellings say $5,000 a week, maybe the number is legendary. But the deal shape, autonomy for a cut, that's the real story. And it explains the respect angle better than any shouted threat ever could. Because the win wasn't Bumpy refused. The win was Bumpy didn't bow and still ended the war without more losses. Why doesn't Luciano crush him? Because Luciano didn't build power by winning every fight. He built it by avoiding the fights that cost more than they pay. Force is costly. Stable cash is priceless. Harlem's numbers money isn't a one-time score you steal and run. It's daily, constant, a living machine. And machines hate chaos. Chaos brings bodies. Bodies bring heat. Heat brings prosecutors, headlines, and men in suits who don't care whose corner it was. Luciano understood that better than most. He helped shape an underworld that preferred structure over street wars. Systems designed to reduce unnecessary bloodshed and keep profits moving. So when Harlem becomes a battlefield, Schultz squeezing, policy bankers resisting, violence dragging on, the smartest move isn't crush everyone. The smartest move is end the noise. Keep the money. That's where Bumpy becomes valuable. Not because he's the toughest man in Harlem, because he can keep Harlem quiet enough to stay profitable. A local operator who can keep peace is worth more than a takeover that turns the neighborhood into a bonfire. And Bumpy's refusal, whether you tell it as legend or as the verified deal shape, sends Luciano a signal that matters. This man isn't a puppet. He's competent. He can manage. He can hold the territory without Italian soldiers flooding the streets and making everything louder. That's the respect, not admiration. Not friendship, recognition. Because a man who refuses the weekly tribute format is saying, I'm not reporting to you. And a man who refuses to work under command is saying, if you want Harlem, you're going to need a war. But a man who offers a cut, a share on partnership terms is also saying something else. You can get paid without bleeding for it. So Luciano doesn't need Bumpy to kneel. He needs the money to flow. He needs Harlem stable. He needs a deal that lets everyone eat, without everyone shooting. And that's why the bold refusal works. Because it forces the only outcome power truly respects. A compromise that looks like strength. Years later, when the smoke of the numbers war became history instead of headlines, May Johnson frames the moment in a way Harlem would understand. Not as a gangster win, as a community outcome. In her telling, what mattered wasn't that Bumpy got loud or that he scared the right people. What mattered was that the conflict ended without more losses, and that the peace that followed felt like it came with honor, not surrender. That word, honor, is the key. Because Harlem had seen what usually happened when outside power moved in. First, you pay. Then, you obey. Then, you pretend it's just business, while your neighborhood becomes somebody else's asset. But Maymay describes Harlem reading the deal differently. For once, people felt like a black man had stood up to white mafia power instead of bowing his head and simply going along to get along. That's not romance. That's social memory. Because in the verified shape of the era, Harlem's numbers world had already been squeezed by Dutch Schultz's takeover pressure, violent enforcement, and a whole economy threatened by men who didn't live there. So when the board finally resets after Schultz's death and the arrangement becomes autonomous with a cut, Harlem kept a local operator, the machine kept running, and the streets didn't have to burn to prove a point. That's why the respect spreads. Not because Bumpy beat Luciano in a showdown, because he protected two things at once: the dignity of not reporting every week like a servant, and the practicality of keeping the money flowing without turning Harlem into a war zone. In cinematic terms, it's not a victory dance. It's a controlled exhale. A neighborhood realizing he didn't just survive the pressure, he negotiated a way through it. He didn't win by taking more. He won by giving up less. Money is loud. It slaps the table. It fills envelopes. It makes weak men feel tall for a minute. But respect? Respect is structural. It's what holds a deal together when nobody's smiling. It's what keeps the money flowing without turning the streets into a graveyard. That's why the real power move here isn't the legend number. It's the posture behind the answer. Because a boss who can't be bought cheap becomes expensive to replace. To remove him, you don't just spend money. You spend stability. You spend peace. You spend years cleaning up the chaos you created. So Bumpy doesn't win by taking more. He wins by giving up less. He holds on to autonomy, Harlem running on Harlem terms, while allowing the kind of cut that keeps downtown satisfied without turning Harlem into a conquered territory. End image. Bumpy stands, straightens his coat, takes one last calm look around the room. Then he walks out like the air belongs to him. And Luciano watches, quiet, measuring, like he just met the kind of man you can't simply order. A weekly payment buys silence. A firm refusal buys respect.